Fame is for honorable people in society who have made a positive impact on our world today. Here are 5 reasons why we believe George Washington should be inducted into the Hall of Fame.
On May 10, 1775, Washington was appointed the commander-in-chief of the newly formed Continental Army. The army was a ragtag, barely trained, and half-starving. The group was also hardly united for much of the war and led by generals who were often undermining or fighting with each other. The victories, while qualified, are remarkable in this light. Despite all Washington did for this cause and the leadership he showed, he refused to take the salary that came with this job. He felt that he owed this to his country. This shows his character and his willingness to serve. Someone like this in the midst of the war is truly outstanding because his values were worthy of honor.
George Washington commanded his ragtag army against what was then the mightiest force in the world, the British Empire, from the shared quarters in the frozen fields of Valley Forge. The conditions at Valley Forge were brutal. The men were literally starving and freezing to death. Disease was rampant and the morale of the army was very low. The army stayed at Valley Forge for 6 months and successfully pulled through the difficult conditions. Although Valley Forge was not a battle between the British and Americans, it is said to be the turning point of the Revolutionary War because the men's spirits were boosted as they overcame this super hard time. If it hadn't been for Washington, Valley Forge would most likely have been the end of the Revolutionary War, and we wouldn't have the American freedom we are blessed with today.
George Washington is probably one of the most humble presidents of all times. When you look in the past at big leaders of the time like Napoleon, one of the people who conquered the most land in the world, after he had conquered land, he simply would go and try to gain more land and more land and more land. Fighting was never done. But when it came to George Washington, he had a task to do, and that's what he did. He did not want to do anything else. When he was done fighting in the Revolutionary War, he simply went home to be with his wife, Martha. Napoleon, on the other hand, decided that he would go and crown himself emperor so that one day he would be remembered, or he would be remembered forever for his great duty that he had accomplished, I guess, for conquering all the land and being this big-headed, mean man, right? But instead you have George Washington, who was so humble and wanted nothing but to spend his life with Martha. And it wasn't until the American people came to him and asked him to be president that he decided that he would, in fact, serve the American people.
George Washington helped to ratify the Constitution. He was one of the first to recognize the weaknesses and flaws present in the Articles of Confederation. His experience as a war general gave him a greater perspective, so that he saw the fatal potential in giving states too much power, as opposed to the central government, which is what the Articles did. It took some time for other people to get on board, but they eventually saw the flaws as well and took action. On May 25, 1787, a convention was opened to change the Articles of Confederation. Washington was the president of this Constitutional Convention, the meeting that generated the Constitution. Immediately after the new Constitution was made to be the law of the land, Washington was elected president.
In 1787, Washington was again called to the duty of his country. Everyone wanted him, everyone voted for him, and he unified the nation with his natural leadership. During his presidency, he adopted a series of measured proposals to reduce the nation's debt, helped to define the powers the presidents hold as outlined in the Constitution. He secured peace with Britain to clear up issues held over from the Revolutionary War and provided over a decade of prosperous trade and development the country so desperately needed. Washington's actions established many precedents in which guide presidents today. He was very wise because he foresaw the negative consequences of political parties and addressed them in his farewell speech. The Hall of Shame is a collection of the worst, most hated, or poorest quality entries in a particular subject, medium, or field. Here are 5 reasons why we believe Herbert Hoover should be inducted into the Hall of Shame.
The Depression worsened when Herbert Hoover was president. 15 million, which is a quarter of American workers, were out of work in 1933. One of these reasons is because he believed in self-reliance and self-help, not government intervention. He failed to recognize the severity of the situation or leverage the power of the federal government to address the issues. government intervention was desperately needed. His being out of touch with the needs of Americans is obvious as on October 25, 1929, 4 days before the stock market crash, Hoover reported to the press, "The fundamental business of the country, that is the production and distribution of commodities, is on a sound and prosperous basis." He went on to say that the economy was doing fine. Another example of the Depression being worsened in his presidency was evident in Hoovervilles. Hoovervilles were shack towns and homeless encampments during the Great Depression. They named these little towns after him because they blamed the Depression being so bad on Herbert Hoover.
I think Herbert Hoover should definitely be put into the Hall of Shame. One of the big reasons is that he was too conservative and that he wasn't doing enough for the American people. While he was following the traditional ways of the president, very hands-off, small federal government, he didn't have the leadership and the foresight to really do what was needed and to enlarge the federal government to help the people. He was just too conservative when the country needed him.
The Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930 had distinct consequences for American foreign affairs. This tariff raised duties on agriculture and industrial imports, which led European and Japanese countries to more cautious and reserved trade, especially towards American products. This tariff produced what historian Benjamin Rhodes had called a suicide international trade war, in the wake of an already shaky economy. Weakening the economy only helped to lead the country to economic failure in the Great Depression, which caused more international issues to deal with. The World Disarmament Conference gathered in Geneva, Switzerland to focus on getting rid of naval weapons, but also included discussions on land forces and weapons. In June of 1932, Hoover took the initiative by proposing the Hoover Plan, in which he wanted a one-third reduction of weapons. His unrealistic proposal also included getting rid of submarines, airplanes, and tanks. Hoover's plan was a complete failure.
In September 1931, Japan attacked Manchuria, which was a Chinese province. This was a direct violation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was an agreement between the major international superpowers to outlaw war. The League of Nations was very weak, and although they tried to punish Japan, nothing came out of their efforts. Hoover decided at the very beginning to just ignore the whole ordeal as to avoid war. As the issue progressed, however, his policy of non-recognition was proclaimed in a document called the Stimson Doctrine. It basically told Japan that America wouldn't recognize Japanese territorial claims in Manchuria, but it had no effect in stopping Japan, and they subsequently laid siege on Shanghai.